The Global Cartel, the organization around the world that owns and controls us all. Now, history, the story of the names, places, dates, events written by the owners, by the winners, is a distraction. It's a cover-up to deceive us thieves and peasants from realizing just how completely we have enslaved ourselves to the great and powerful Oz, the wizards behind the curtain, also known as the Pharisees and their flunkies, Satan worshippers and Antichrist, one and all. One thing in here that I'm going to be reading from these little index cards, and I will go off in tangents at some time or another, and it'll be just like the other videos you've seen, just my voice only. So suck it up. Okay, so we go. Trump and his administration is merely the most recent flunkies in the clown parade of U.S. history. This guy doesn't have a clue, and we'll look at him closer in the next video. Right now, all I see is a 79-year-old lord-ass with failing systems. And it's no wonder he's talking now about getting into heaven, because he's a walking dead man, a dead man walking. And the last word I had, Satan worshippers, preparatory and Antichrist don't get into heaven. And that's what Trump is. I really pity the poor guy. He's suffering from dementia just like his father. Ah, come on, card. What is this? I hate these things. And I wouldn't be doing these videos if somebody else had done them first. Everything you see on the internet is just superficial. They're covering the surface and nothing. What I'm trying to do is get below the surface and tell you what's really going on. Okay, back to Trump. He's demented just like his father. He's incontinent, and by the looks of the bags under his eyes, his kidneys and adrenals are failing. His circulation is shot. He probably has very high blood pressure and is probably borderline, if not outright diabetic. And he's a drug addict by his own accounts, snorting his Dr. Feelgood meds. Look it up if you don't believe it. Not only is Diaper Don not going to make America great again, he is leading us, the U.S. and the West, into the Greater Depression of the Great Reset, where you will own nothing and you will be happy. And you peasants will eat bugs. Thank you, Satan, Klaus Schwab. Now, this is why Trump is the chosen one. The owners chose him and groomed him from birth to make America go away and die. Magad, M-A-G-A-D. Which brings us to the Global Cartel, the owners. The Global Cartel is a physical trinity, 3 in 1. It consists of A, the Frankfurt Combine, B, the Roman Jesuit Church, and C, the European royal family. These 3 branches are all related and interconnected because they stem from the same root, Satanic Pharisee Judaism. Now, as we have seen, Pharisee Judaism begins before Christ, but it was the Pharisees who forced Pilate to crucify and murder Yeshua. And it is Pharisee Judaic law which survives to this day. Now, the Frankfurt Combine dates to about 1772 or 3. It arose out of a conclave that Meyer Amschel Rothschild called to invite the prominent members of the elite families of the Frankfurt Judengasse, or Jew Alley, to attend. Okay, right now I'm going to be skipping over a lot of stuff. I'm going to be reading and I'm going to be skipping back and forth, and I'll probably lose my place and blah, blah, blah. On with the show. Now, I suspect that Meyer Amschel was a financial savant because he was only 30 at 1773. But he had apprenticed at age 13 to an Oppenheimer bank in Hanover. And he wormed his way into the good graces of the Duke William of Hesse-Hanau, just outside of Frankfurt, who was son of the elector at Hanover and said to be one of the richest men in Europe. He initially sold rare coins and medals, military medals and civilian awards, to the Duke who collected them. And he reestablished connection with General von Estorff, who was the factor at Duke William's palace. And it was he who introduced Meyer Amschel to the Duke and assisted Meyer Amschel, for bribes of course, in gaining more loans, discounting loans to the Duke, selling him rare coins and medals at a discounted price, and so on. But he was the richest man in Europe because he's the guy, if you remember anything about the American Revolution and the Hessian soldiers, this was the guy who rented his civilian soldiers to his grandfather, George III, out of England. Now, some of the names that you have heard of and will hear again here were at that conclave. Most likely to have been invited include the Schiffs, Schwab, Guggenheim, Oaks, Wertheim, Oppenheimer, Speyer, can you read my own writing? And Jacob Frank, the current Jewish Messiah, was likely there. Adam Weishaupt, who was the Illuminatist and a Jesuit professor at Ingolstadt University, was there, and likely some prominent rabbis, some prominent Pharisee rabbis. Maybe also Moses Mendelssohn of the Jewish Enlightenment was there. Anyway, the attendees agreed to join together their talents and their time and their money to gain power and control over nations and peoples, and to infiltrate every facet and aspect of Gentile life, primarily through the money. I think, this is an aside here, I think it's probably likely that the protocols of the learned elders of Zion date from this conclave. It's always called a forgery. And that implies that there is a genuine protocols somewhere. If it's not at this conclave, then it's probably, it grows out of, anyway, the Talmud Torah. Because that is full of anti-Gentile and anti-Christian blather. Now, we will probably come back to this time of 1770, 1780 and go into further depth on some of these subjects. But for now, just a small list of the Frankfurt Combine / Rothschild involvements. You can find a more complete list online if you look. Okay. They were involved in the American and French revolutions. No doubt about it. The first Bank of the U.S., Washington and Hamilton. Hamilton was the little Jewish peddler, Jefferson called him, from Nevis down in the Caribbean. And he wormed his way in and up to be an aide of Washington and later a general under Washington. He was a Mason. All of those guys in that army, the generals especially, were Masons, Freemasons, Satanists. And many of the founding fathers were also slave owners. So, endowed with your Creator with certain inalienable powers, being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The only problem is that we were not all created equal under the Declaration. Only landed gentry, not just ordinary commoners, peasants like you and me. But they were mostly slave owners. And their attitude, I think, was kind of summed up by a guy named Randolph, one of the premier families out of Virginia, who said, "I am an aristocrat. I despise equality." That was their attitude. Okay, anyway, Hamilton was connected to the Rothschilds through his wife, Elizabeth Schuyler, whose mother was a Van Rensselaer, and the Schuylers, Van Rensselaers, and Van Cortlands out of New York, New Amsterdam, were connected to the Rothschilds out of Europe and London. And so was Hamilton. And it was his idea for the first Bank of the United States, a central bank, and Washington went along because he didn't know any better. He was kind of a dumbass like Trump. Okay. The Rothschild Combine financed England and France in the wars in Europe. Wellington and Russia, and all the rest against Napoleon. Now, after the Battle of Waterloo, I'm skipping a lot of stuff here now. After the Battle of Waterloo, Rothschild, Nathan Meyer, in London, made his famous coup on the stock exchange, because he had 24-hour notice that Wellington had defeated Napoleon. But he went in and sold consols, which were British debt, British bonds, some of which had voting rights to the Bank of England, the national central bank. So he went in and sold consols short, and everybody around him believed that Wellington had been beaten. So they started selling short too and drove the price of consols way down. And Nathan Meyer, standing by his pillar, giving silent signals to his cohorts who were doing the buying, gave the signal to start buying, and they did. He drove the price right back up above where it had been at the start of trading. So he made a profit on the way down and on the way back. Plus, he had voting rights to the Bank of England. And along about 1830s, 1830 is a very important year in a lot of ways. 1830 was pretty much the year that Nathan Meyer had control of the Bank of England, the central bank. He was the banker in England. In the 1830 earlys, George Peabody of the prominent New England family Peabodys sailed to England and became Nathan Meyer's and the Rothschild spy, because the Pharisees, the Judeo-Pharisees at that time did not have their civil rights in England until about 1856, 57, long in there. So Peabody was their spy, and he reported back to his employer, Nathan Meyer, all that was going on among the elite Brits, and made his decisions accordingly. Now, George Peabody's protege was a guy named Junius Spencer Morgan, probably out of the merchant bank Morgan Grenfell. I don't know. I did not do the genealogies here, and a lot of genealogies you can't do anymore online because the genealogical sites have been taken down. Anyway, Junius Spencer's son was John Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan of New York City fame. He was one of the two primary Rothschild agents in the States at that time, around from, say, 1875 to about 1925, long in there. Anyway, he controlled the Bank of England. Also, he was heavily involved, if not the prime director of the British-Dutch East India Company, which grew poppies in India plantations and traded the opium or poppy juice and silver into China to addict the Chinese people and to take control of China. The Jesuits were there with him. A lot of the early large fortunes in the United States were made by families who dealt dope out in China. For example, the Forbes brothers. There were 3 Forbes brothers, 3 Russell brothers. There was a Cheney family, Chanay, which may or may not have been ancestors of our Big Dick Cheney, later VP. And the Delanos, that's another prominent name. But there's all kinds of lists on the internet where you can find it. But these were the first large fortunes made. Now, Elihu Yale, the founder of Yale Academy, which became Yale University, was also involved. Fancy that. All these big guys were dopers, drug smugglers, bankers, laundering money. Now, their big bank out there was the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank, HSBC now, the Hong Shang Bank, which laundered the money. Anyway, you can see from the start, from very early on, that American flunkies were heavily involved with crime and slavery and addiction and the love of money, which is the root of all evil. And they are still influential in this country now. During the Civil War, Rothschild had flunkies on both sides of the battle, and Masons were on both sides of the front, and they entertained one another, according to what you read at times. They were civil to one another. But Stanton, Edward Stanton, who was the Secretary of War in the North, and Judah P. Benjamin, who was had various jobs in the Confederacy. He was Secretary of State, Vice President at one time. But they were both Rothschild flunkies in England. The Lincoln assassination was a Rothschild scam by the Booth, John Wilkes Booth organization. And Booth did not die in that barn fire, but was saved by Stanton and shipped out to England, where he is reported to have lived out his life. Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? Classic joke, if you go for that sort of thing. Now, after the war, old John D. Rockefeller, son of a dope dealer and medicine show entrepreneur who abandoned his family, married another woman, bigamist, cheated his sons, according to one biography I read, cheated his sons to make them tough. So John D. didn't want to go to war, so he bought his way out, which you could at that time. You could pay somebody to go fight for you, so John D. did, and he became a supplier of goods to the Union Army and made a few bucks. After the war in Cleveland, he went into oil refining. At that time, they were refining crude to provide primarily kerosene and heating oil, lamp oil, heating oil. And there were all sorts of refineries up and down the Schuylkill, I think was the name of the river. And John D. got a loan. His first big loan was from a Rothschild bank in Cleveland for $75,000. Read that somewhere. You can read it too. But he got into refining crude oil, buying up refineries there. And the reputation he gained was John D. Rockefeller. He would either buy you out or burn you out. And he did. And the story is that that river became so polluted at one time that it caught on fire. Would have liked to seen that. But anyway, sometime around 1880, old Rockefeller was called to New York, and he met with railroad people who gave him a 5-cent rebate on each barrel of oil that he shipped by rail. At that time, there were no gas pipelines, no oil pipelines. Oil was shipped in barrels, literal barrels on trains. And he was given a 5-cent per barrel rebate on every barrel that he shipped, plus a 5-cent rebate on every barrel that his competitors shipped. Would you call that grooming? I would. He was chosen. And he did. He was backed by J.P. Morgan and Jacob Schiff. Schiff of the Frankfurt Combine, who grew up in the same house that the Rothschilds did. It appears that that was a shotgun house, if you know what I mean, multi-storied, and the Rothschilds lived on one side of the wall and the Schiffs on the other side. Out front were these signs, which indicated the Haus zum Roten Shield, or the House of the Red Shield, and the Haus zum Schiff, the House of the Ship, which is what Schiff means. Anyway, these two agents turned Rockefeller into a monopolist. And the Standard Oil monopoly was the only oil company of any size in this country for a long time. Excuse me. It was eventually broken up into, there was Standard Oil of Ohio, Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of California. But Rockefeller and his associates didn't care. He put it, we gave up ownership for control, which is what they did. I mean, it satisfied the Congress and the monopolists, anti-monopolists, but it didn't change things at all. So, Standard Oil spread around the world and eventually settled in every major country in the world. Along about 1832, we'll cover this too, there was a reports that I read of MI6, British Foreign Intelligence, converting the Pharisee Saud family in Arabia into Wahhabi Islam, Wahhabi Muslims. This guy Wahhab was not fundamentalist, except as it suited him, it seemed. Anyway, the Saudi family now are converts to Islam, Marranos, and ditto in Turkey with Kemal Ataturk and the Young Turks, the Dernme Party. They were also Marranos who converted to Islam on the outside to rule Turkey. So there is that history in Turkey. And, well, I won't go into that here. Anyway, okay, let's go back to Rockefeller and Standard Oil. Then at that same time, and railroad monopolies. And from the Harrimans, we get Averill Harriman, Bob Lovett, who was a factotum to the Harrimans and was influential in many presidential administrations. Prescott Bush. Well, let me put it this way. The Bushes and the Harrimans first got together when a Bush out of Toledo, Ohio, sold railroad stock to Edward H. Harriman. Now, Prescott Bush and Averill Harriman were classmates at Yale, Skull and Bones. And Harriman went back to work in New York with Brown Brothers Harriman, and so did Prescott Bush. Prescott Bush married the daughter of George Herbert Walker, who was the factotum at the time for Harriman, E.H., the old railroad guy. And Bob Lovett was associated with him too, because Lovett's father was involved with the Harrimans as well, and it is said that Mrs. Harriman liked Bob Lovett even more than her own son Averill. Make of that what you will. Anyway, we come down from Prescott Bush and George Herbert Walker's daughter, and they had George Herbert Walker Bush, Poppy Bush, who was Yale, Skull and Bones, CIA from the get-go, Zapata offshore oil. Oil has always been big in the spy business, and so was Poppy Bush. There's a picture of him standing out front of the school book depository on the day that Kennedy was murdered, labeled by the FBI as George Bush of the CIA. Then there's Dub, George W. Bush, who was Poppy Bush's son, and Barbara Bush, who was reputed to be the daughter of Aleister Crowley. I don't know whether that is or not, but it would make a certain sense. Anyway, there's old Dub. And there's lots of things you could say about Dub, but he was connected from the get-go. I don't want to get into Dub much. Anyway, here we go. We've got, where did we end? We've got, we need to go into South Africa too. Rothschild and Cecil Rhodes, South Africa, gold, diamonds, metal ores, etc. Control of South Africa. And Rothschild, the Lord Rothschild at the time, was the executor of the first 5 of Cecil Rhodes' wills, later taken over by Lord Alfred Milner, which we'll hear more about. And the Rhodes Scholarships come out of his will. And those scholarships are awarded to preferred flunkies to be groomed for Rothschild. And they are, not just from the States, but around the world. Oh yeah, we covered that one. Okay. We come down to about 1890s too. Theodore Herzl and his Zionist crowd wanting a Jewish homeland in Palestine come to the Lord Rothschild at the time, and Rothschild probably had to subdue his enthusiasm as if it was a revelation. Because Rothschild wanted Palestine because of Suez and the canal that was built there. He did not invest initially in the canal, from what I read, but he became a big owner, director, his flunkies anyway, of the Suez Canal Company. And he also wanted to drive a wedge between the Muslim countries stretching from the west way out there to Morocco and the Western Africa, all the way to the Philippines and beyond to the east. So this Pharisee wedge was there all along to divide and rule. That is the primary rule. Probably law. Divide and rule, and it goes on today, and you can see it in America clearly. The maggots versus the neolibs. The blacks versus the whites. Everybody against the illegal immigrants. But it's all engineered because we are all, like I showed you in Christians' lives, that we are all descended from black African women and men. We are all black African descent. We are all black origin. There is no difference. Caucasians, blacks, Indians, Chinese, Judeo-Pharisees are monkeys, just like all the rest of us. Don't tell them that. You'll probably shoot your ass. Okay, anyway, old Herzl went for the Uganda option, and he disappeared, either murdered, died naturally at 40, or was suicided. Who knows? But anyway, that organization of Pharisees and Judeo-Pharisees that were already beginning to move into Palestine were called the Yishuv, Y-I-S-H-U-V. And they wrote Rothschild after a while, wanting him to take the hands off of them so that they could develop the way they wanted. And Rothschild wrote back essentially telling them, the Yishuv is mine. Do not interfere with my plans. And so the state of Israel today, the land of Israel in the Old Testament, Greater Israel in modern parlance, is Rothschild. Rothschild owns Israel, just like that Combine and the cartel owns the U.S. and the West and Russia and China and India and everything else in the world. They own you and me and all our assets. Everything we think we own is theirs. Take it or leave it. Like it or lump it. So we come down to the Panic of 1907 in the States. Now that was engineered supposedly by J.P. Morgan. That's the story I get. Morgan started the rumor that the Knickerbocker Bank in New York City was broke and started a run on banks, the Panic of 1907, to set up the formation of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, our central bank. But before we get into that, we'll get into Woodrow Wilson's election. Now, Woodrow Wilson was a professor, supposedly of history, at Princeton. He wrote, from what I read, a 10-volume series that has become the basis of the racial problem in the States. He was a racist from South Carolina, Charleston, I want to say, but I'm not sure about that. Anyway, he was a professor at Princeton. And old Colonel House, who was the son of a blockade runner during the Civil War, became Wilson's chief cook and bottle washer, his chief of staff, and the guy who really owned him. Now, House's father, the blockade runner, had refused to accept paper money from the Confederates for all the stuff he brought in, and took only gold and took it back to London and banked it at Baring Brothers, and he was acquainted with Rothschild at the time. And after the war, he was one of the richest men in Texas, and sickly old Edward Mandel went into politics, which is fairly common for those guys. The first guy robs, steals, and gets the money, and the other generations go into politics and blah, blah, blah to keep the money. So anyway, Edward Mandel picked old Wilson because he knew beforehand Wilson's foibles and failures. These guys don't fool around. They knew Wilson from the get-go, and they picked him to be the president. He became president of Princeton and then the Democratic candidate for president of the United States against William Howard Taft, who Schiff supported. And then J.P. Morgan, the story goes, persuaded Teddy Roosevelt, to come out of retirement and run on the Bull Moose Party. And he did. And that split the Republican Party so that Wilson was elected. Does that strike any chords, say, with Poppy Bush, Perot, and Clinton? Anyway, on with the show. Now, Wilson, it seems, had an affair with the wife of a colleague at Princeton and had written her love letters. Kind of a dumbass. And the woman contacted him later needing money for her son, either $60,000 or $40,000. I've seen both figures. And a guy named Samuel Untermeyer, who we'll talk about again in just a minute, a wealthy New York lawyer associated with the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Morgans, on and on. Anyway, he agreed with Wilson to put up the money and get the letters if Wilson would appoint Louis Dimwitz Brandeis to the Supreme Court, the first Pharisee Jew boy to the Supreme Court, and Wilson agreed. So now the Rothschilds had him by the short hairs and made mincemeat out of that poor guy, dumbass. And you can see parallels with old Trump today and with every president since then, since Wilson. Okay. Now, Samuel Untermeyer and Jacob Schiff were backers of the Schofield Reference Bible. Osiris Schofield, who was a convicted felon, a wife abuser, and I don't know that he was a pedophile, but he was a child abuser anyway. He, with their financing, he is regarded as the author of the Schofield Reference Bible, which brings in all kinds of garbage out of the past. John Nelson Darby's rapture crap. Rapture of the Church. Darby, it seems, was a homosexual, a pedophile, and there was something else I forget right now, but that seems to be enough. Not a very tasteful guy, and neither was Schofield. And Schofield's Bible, that piece of garbage, is a big deal in the evangelical community. You hear talk again and again about the rapture of the church, which is garbage. It ain't gonna happen. It's a scam, folks. Look it up. Okay. Now we go on into 1913 and the Federal Reserve System, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Rockefeller Foundation. The Federal Reserve Act was passed during a Christmas recess. There may or may not have been a quorum in Congress to pass that thing, and it went into effect in August or so of 1914. The Internal Revenue Service, which is supposedly unconstitutional, was also passed. And everybody's heard about the Rockefeller Foundation, what great guys they are. Then we come up to about 1914, 1917 hours. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration, which was a letter to the then Lord Rothschild, promising British support for a homeland for the Pharisees, Jews in quotes, in Palestine after the war. That was a payoff to the Rothschild organization for Schiff and Morgan and House to blackmail old Wilson into declaring war against Germany on the American side. Six months before Wilson declared war, most Americans were totally against going to war in Europe because a lot of Americans were of German descent. It took Edward Bernays, the godfather of modern public relations and propaganda, to turn America around. And pretty soon it was over there, send the word over there, and they went. And the expression in Europe was, the Yanks are oversexed, overpaid, and over here. Anyway, just a lighter moment. Anyway, there you go. But it was after World War I was signed, the Paris Peace Treaty and all that bull, that a meeting was held in Paris, I believe, could have been in London, among the elites of Milner's Kindergarten and the American elites. Wilson wasn't there. He was just a flunky. Anyway, this was where the Chatham House, Tavistock, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the Council of Foreign Relations came into being. Organized efforts and propaganda against peoples and nations. Edward Bernays and Lippmann are reported to have been put in charge of public relations and newspapers and publishing. And now, the last report I saw said 6 transnational corporations own 90+% of the mainstream media in this country. That's everything. Radio, TV, publishing, newspapers, on and on and on. And it also means on the internet. Internet influencers, podcasts, blah, 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 ad infinitum. ad nauseum. But there are a lot of, they're called young global leaders now at Davos. But there was also a training program for all these people, and Rhodes Scholarships is one of them. Probably Woodrow Wilson scholarships here in the States. Okay, then we get into the 20s, the roaring 20s. In 1924, old J. Edgar Hoover is appointed FBI director, and he's there for 100 years. Hoover was a faggot, him and his buddy Tolson. And the crime families out of New York got photographs of Hoover giving Tolson a blowjob, and Hoover dressed in his black evening dress with high heels prancing around. I have heard years ago that it was a red dress, but I guess not. The latest is that it was a black dress or navy, dark. Anyway, that's why Hoover vowed for years that there was no Cosa Nostra, no mafia, no crime families in the country. What they don't tell you either is that Hoover and Tolson used to go to the racetrack with the crime boss out of New York. And this crime boss used to complain to his colleagues about how much trouble he had to go to get to fix races so that Hoover could win a $2 bet. The only thing is, Hoover was ostentatious at the $2 window, while his subservient agents were down at the $100 window placing bets on that same horse. Anyway, the FBI has been crooked and corrupt since then, and most everybody knows it. It's left over. Same today. Epstein files. Uh-oh. We hit a nerve there, didn't we? And Russia probably has I figure Russia's got a copy of that, because all the international intelligence agencies, both here and overseas, are tied in together. And what one has, they all have. Except if Israel Mossad gets it first, they don't hand it out, usually. Probably unless ordered to by the owners. Okay, we come up to 1929. Stock market crash, Great Depression, blah, 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 FDR and the New Deal. In 1933, and you can see this online, maybe, that picture of the New York Times page, 1933, article written by, or under the byline anyway, of Samuel Untermeyer, that guy again, saying that the Jews had declared war on Germany. Now, where have you heard that before? Nowhere. Who owns the media? Now, I understand why you ain't heard it before. Jews are victims. Everybody knows that. Anti-Semitism and all that. Holocaust. We'll get into that too. Anyway, they declared war on Germany with their global boycott of German